How's it going, everyone? My name is Trevor Duffner. I am the TA for Dr. Freddy's Exercise Physiology 2 course. You've probably seen me in lab. Today, I'm going to be presenting to you a presentation on muscular fitness assessment and exercise programming. Essentially, I'm going to be trying to go through this as fast as I possibly can, but also cover the main key concepts. We're going to be talking about a few different review topics: muscle anatomy, muscle action, muscle function, some of the mechanisms behind muscle contraction, and then we're going to jump into different types of muscular assessments and finally some recommendations for prescription of exercise. So jumping in right away here, talk about some vocabulary review. So talking about strength or muscular strength. So this is simply the ability of the muscle group or muscles to voluntarily produce force against external resistance. So usually when you're talking about strength, you're talking about maximal strength. So we talk about maximal or the maximal ability of the muscle or muscle group to voluntarily produce force against an external resistance. And so there's two different ways you can think about this. So there's an absolute way, which is essentially just the measurement of the weight that you're lifting. If you were squatting 225 pounds, your absolute resistance, your absolute strength is 225 pounds, or it can be relative to the individual. So it can be something like 80% of your 1RM. So if your 1RM is 225, take 80% of that, and that would be your relative measure for that lift. Next thing we'll talk about is muscular power, or power. It's the sum of force produced and the speed at which the movement was completed. So essentially, the heavier something is and the faster that you can move it, the more power you're going to be generating. So you think about this: if you're explosive, talking about explosive strength or power, if you're moving a very heavy object very fast, that generates a lot of power. And finally, hypertrophy. So hypertrophy is just the increase in cross-sectional area of the muscle, not to be confused with hyperplasia, which is an increase in the amount of cells. Hypertrophy is just an increase in the actual size of the muscles themselves. So looking at the muscles themselves, we can see here we have our basic muscle structure, starting with our total muscle body, breaking it down into our fascicles, into our myofibrils, and then into our myofilaments, actin and myosin. So the important thing that I'm going to say to take from this diagram here is to see that we have our nucleus, or we have our multiple nucleated cells. So here we have our muscle fibers, which are our muscle cells, which have the sarcolemma around them. They have multiple nuclei, so they're multinucleated. And then we have the sarcoplasm and our myofibrils within the muscle cells, which are actually the things that are responsible for the muscle contraction. So diving into it a bit further, looking at the myofibril, we see here we have our actin and our myosin filaments. This should all be reviewed, so I'm not going to go over it too much. We should remember our tryptomyosin and our troponin. So we should remember that when calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it attaches to the troponin, which moves the tryptomyosin, which allows the actin and the myosin to go through cross-bridge cycling in order to enable it to produce force. That's all I'm going to go over there. So for a motor unit, so a little bit more, this should be also reviewed as well, but a motor unit is something that I see sometimes in physiology classes, people not really understanding. So a motor unit is just the alpha motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. So we see here, we have motor unit 1, which is innervating 2 different muscle fibers, and then we have motor unit 2, which is larger, and it's innervating 3 different muscle fibers. And these can range from anywhere. I think the smallest ones are in the eyes, anywhere from like 4 to 6 muscle fibers per alpha motor neuron. And then you have large ones in, like, let's say in the quadriceps, that are thousands of muscle fibers per motor neuron. And as the motor unit gets larger, as you are innervating or as you are stimulating more muscle fibers, the size of that alpha motor neuron is actually getting larger. Then comes into play what's something called the Henneman size principle. So the Henneman size principle, if you don't recall, is a principle or a theory that states that the smallest motor units are always recruited first. And that's because of the size of their alpha motor neuron. Smaller alpha motor neurons are more easily stimulated, or they're more easy to influence. And therefore, these smaller motor units are going to be the ones that are recruited first. So as you increase in the intensity of whatever you're doing, you're going to be recruiting the smallest motor units first, and then you're going to be increasing in size as you go, or as you increase in the intensity of your lift. These motor units also follow something called the all or none principle, essentially saying that they are either firing or they're not. When muscles contract, or when there's an action potential fired from that alpha motor neuron, there's only one signal that's sent from that alpha motor neuron. It can be sent multiple times and in tandem, but that one signal is always the same strength. The way that you increase the intensity or you increase the amount of force being produced by the muscle fiber itself is by firing that motor neuron more and more and more. And as we should know, right, the contraction of that muscle cell is stimulated by the action potential. The action potential comes down the motor neuron, it transfers into the motor end plate, and then an electrical signal is sent throughout the muscle, thereby, like I said, releasing the calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that enables the rest of the muscular contraction cascade. Now we're going to jump into muscle fiber types. So we have our slow twitch and we have our fast twitch. So something I'm going to say here is that there's no set like black and white. There's no categories. There's no this, right? Essentially, all muscle fibers are on a continuum. However, we categorize them based on a grouping or a set of characteristics that they that they share in common with some of the other muscle fibers, right? So like all things in physiology, there's no on-off here. There's no set scale for these things. It's all on a continuum, and then we kind of group them into different categories along that continuum. So the first one being here is our slow twitch fibers, or type 1. So these are going to be our efficient and fatigue resistance. They're going to have a high capacity for aerobic-like type things. So these are going to be our smaller muscle fibers as well, and they're going to be limited in their ability to produce anaerobic power. So because they don't have a high rate of force development, and because they are small, they're limited in their ability to produce power. But they're really, really good at doing long-term contractions over a long period of time and being very, very fatigue resistant. These are things that you typically would utilize in aerobic style events. Now, the fast twitch fibers, the type 2A and the type 2X, and not written here, but also type 2B, these fibers are a little bit more inefficient and they're fatigable. These are meant specifically for anaerobic style things. They're large and they have high rate of force development. So these are the fibers that you're predominantly using when you are doing heavy explosive lifts or heavy explosive movements. These are the fibers that are meant to change direction really fast and to move really heavy things really, really fast. However, they do not produce force for a long period of time. That is what you rely on your type 1 fibers for. So just a general breakdown of the muscle fiber types here. I don't think Dr. Freddy is going to make you know every single individual one. They're not going to say what's type 2A's relaxation speed. But essentially, this is breaking it down and showing you kind of how each thing is here. And essentially, you can think about them as being kind of opposite of each other, right? So type 2X fibers are going to be kind of the opposite of type 1 fibers. Motor neuron size are large versus small. Versus you come down here, you look at their power output, low versus high, or contraction speed, slow versus fast. And then this intermediate fiber is going to be kind of in between all of those things. Hence, again, saying that they're kind of on this continuum, right? And then these just happen to be the categories that we have kind of carved out of that continuum. Looking at types of muscle contractions. So hopefully this should all be a review as well. I apologize, this image is a little bit cut off here. First thing we're talking about is the most common one that we all know well and we do every single day is isotonic movements. So isotonic movements are a movement in which the length of the muscle body is changing. If the muscle body is shortening, that is a concentric contraction. So that would be, let's say, like the upwards portion. I'll move myself over here so you guys can see me. That would be like the upwards portion of a biceps curl, okay? Then the eccentric contraction would be the lengthening of a muscle body. So like the downwards portion of a bicep curl. So as I come up, right, my biceps is shortening. As I go down, my biceps is lengthening. Up concentric, down eccentric. And now up and down isn't always concentric and eccentric. It's all dependent on the muscle body itself. It's getting shorter, eccentric, it's getting longer, eccentric. And then isometric. So isometric is a contraction in which there is no muscle movement. So that would be like me locking my arm in place and holding onto a weight, something like a plank or a forearm plank, or let's say like a wall sit, or let's say you're doing a squat and you hold an isometric contraction at the bottom, whatever it might be, any sort of contraction where the muscle body itself is not changing in length. So talking about muscular adaptations or adaptations in general that occur to increase muscular strength, power, whatever have you. The first one is going to be neural adaptations. So there's going to be an increased neural drive. So this is essentially just a sum of adaptations related to an increase in muscle recruitment, an improvement in neuronal firing rate, greater synchronization, and greater reduced inhibitory mechanism. So essentially, if there is a greater amount of recruitment for certain movements, if the firing rate from the neuron or from the motor cortex is more efficient and fires at a more efficient time scale, if the synchronization of the muscles, so let's say you have a bunch of different muscle fibers or motor units in the biceps, if they are firing in synchronization, it's going to generate more force. You can think about this like, let's say you're doing a tug of war, right? Usually when you do a tug of war, if you've ever done one, you want everybody on the same side be pulling at the same time. If you're pulling at random, non-calculated, non-synchronous times, you're not going to be able to generate as much force as a group as if you all pull at the same time. So part of the neural adaptation for resistance training is that there is greater synchronization of the action potentials firing and the contraction of the motor units themselves. Because if they can all contract pretty much at the same time, you're going to get a higher extrinsic or a higher force output. And then finally, more reduced inhibitory mechanisms. So there are specific mechanisms in the body, specifically in the muscle, things like the Golgi tendon organ, that are meant to protect the muscle from you damaging it. Essentially, what happens through training is you can kind of modulate that inhibitory mechanism and turn it down just a little bit because you've trained that mechanism to say, hey, we can push ourselves a little bit further. And essentially, a combination of all these factors that you see listed here is what allow for neural adaptation to resistance training. So we see here is essentially just a simple graph. We're looking at the changes in neural adaptations, hypertrophy, and strength over time. And as we see here, usually in about the first 6 weeks of strength training, the strength training or the increase in strength that you see is almost entirely neuronal in nature. It is almost entirely on the neural side. Essentially, all these factors that we just talked about here are improving, and that's why you get something called newbie gains. You'll get people that come in the first 6 weeks, and their 1RM or whatever lift they're doing will explode by 40 or 50%. And you think, damn, I've been doing this for 3 years, and I've only got up 10% in the last year, right? That's because you've now moved on to relying on hypertrophy for muscle strength gains. So we see here, after a certain period of time, the neuronal adaptations will balance out. The neural adaptations will essentially not flatline, but not be nearly as high. It'll, for the most part, a flatline. But then strength increase relies predominantly on the hypertrophy gains, so the increase in muscular size. And so after a certain period of time, you no longer are effectively just learning to do the movement better. Now you are relying on greater contractile tissue and more sarcoplasmic energetic availability within the muscle to increase muscular strength or muscular power. And muscular hypertrophy is much harder to train and much harder to come by than the early neural gains. And that's why if you're 3 years in and you're training with your buddy or your friend who's never trained before, and you see their 40% jump, but you're like, dang, I've only jumped 10%. It's because they have those neural gains and you only are allowed, or you're past those neural gains and you're relying on the hypertrophy gains, which are much, much harder to come by and much, much harder to train. So don't be discouraged. The law of diminishing returns is always evident, and it happens to every single person. So a few different assessments of neural adaptation. So we can use electromyography or EMG. Essentially what these devices are doing is you can just attach them to a muscle body and you can record the muscle action potential. Excuse me. You can record the muscle action potential or the signals as they spread across the sarcolemma. So you can use this to look at a few different things. You can look at voluntary muscle action, involuntary muscle action. You can look at the health of the neural system. You can look at adaptation and training over time. Essentially, you can use this function or you can use this product to analyze a whole plethora of different things that we don't need to go into right now. But it's a very cool technology. This allows you to analyze the actual electrical flow within the muscle and within the neurons themselves. Looking at muscle cell adaptations, right? So we talked about some neural adaptations, some muscle cell adaptations. So skeletal muscle adapts primarily by increasing its size, hypertrophy. So there is a little bit of evidence that shows that hyperplasia may be occurring in your adult life, but usually it's not very much, if any, at all. So usually most of the muscle adaptation that you get is just going to be an increase in the size of the muscle fibers that you already have, not an increase in the amount of muscle fibers themselves. So essentially what you're doing is you're facilitating fiber type transitions. So let's say you're training very, very heavily, you're doing power training. You are training all of your fibers to be more anaerobic in nature. So those fibers that are kind of in the middle, kind of the type 1A fibers, they're going to be able to begin to develop more anaerobic tendencies. So they're going to start to shift towards this type 2 area versus, let's say, you're doing a lot of type 1 training. Some of your more middle fibers, your type 2A, are going to begin to shift more in the aerobic direction. They're going to become more capillarized. They're going to have more mitochondria. They're going to be better able to produce aerobic power or aerobic mechanisms rather than producing the anaerobic ones. As well as you'll be enhancing its biomechanical and ultrastructural components. So things like increasing the amount of myofibrils, increasing pennation angle, just a few different things that are going to allow you to generate more force. Right, so here, hypertrophy is just an increase in the size of the muscle cells. Hyperplasia is an increase in the amount of muscle cells. Again, remember, almost always, the increase in strength that you are seeing is reliance or a response to the amount of hypertrophy that's occurring. Hyperplasia does not typically occur nearly as much, if at all, as hypertrophy. So fiber size changes. So both type 1 and type 2 fibers have the potential to be recruited, right? Increase in fiber and cross-sectional area for both. So if you are training a fiber and you are fatiguing that fiber, you are going to see an increase in muscle fiber size. So type 2 muscle fibers, typically have a greater increased size than type 1 fibers. And this is for a few different factors, right? One of them being is that type 2 fibers will go through two types of hypertrophy. You'll increase myofibrils as well as you'll go through sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which I'm not sure if I talk about here. I don't think I do. But essentially the idea being is type 2X or type 2 fibers in general have a more capacity to go through hypertrophy, as well as they're already larger in general. So when a larger structure increases its size by 10%, that's going to be a larger absolute value than a smaller structure, right? 10% of 100 is 10, goes to 100, from 100 to 110, but 10% of 10 is only 1, so it's going from 10 to 11. So if their size of the original fiber is already larger, a 10% increase is going to be an even larger absolute increase. Hence why type 2 fibers have more of a capacity for hypertrophy than type 1 fibers. Like I said, fibers are theoretically positioned on a continuum from least to most oxidative, essentially from most to least ability to perform aerobic metabolism. All right, yeah, I think that's pretty much all I need to cover here. So consistent activation of type 2X fibers results in a shift to a more oxidative form. Essentially what this is saying is if you are continuously activating type 2X fibers, if those type 2X fibers are active a lot and you're using them for long, repetitive things, that's a little bit more aerobic than they are built for, so they're going to begin to shift to more of their oxidative form. Now, if you take those type 2X fibers and you're using them very sporadically for explosive heavy lifts, you're going to see a shift of the other fibers into more of a type 2X form. And I'll kind of say this as a way to combat any confusion. You're not seeing a change from like type 1. Type 1 is not going all the way from type 1 to type 2X. And type 2X is not going all the way from type 2X to type 1. It's just sort of shifting a little bit more in that way, right? You're taking a muscle fiber that is built a very specific way, and you're training it to behave a little bit differently, but you're not changing that fiber overall fundamentally. Right? Unless we talked about earlier, where this training can increase the angle of pennation. So increased angle of pennation allows you to generate more force. I'm not going to go too much more in detail than that. But essentially the idea being is if you want to increase muscle force within a specific muscle body, increasing the muscle pennation angle is going to allow you to generate more force. The resistant training also increases myofibril volume, cytoplasmic density, sarcoplasmic reticulum, and T-tubule density, and sodium potassium ATPase activity. So essentially, if you're increasing the myofibril volume, you're increasing the contractile units, so more myosin, more actin, which means more force generating capacity. If you're increasing the sarcoplasmic density, that means more readily available energy sources right there. Your muscles rely very heavily on glucose to produce force, produce ATP, which produces force, right? So if you have a lot more readily available glucose right there, you can produce more force and therefore potentially have higher strength, or at least be more fit, right? Greater T-tubule density in cytoplasmic reticulum is going to increase the amount of calcium release and how that calcium can be transferred throughout the cell, making muscle contraction more efficient. And then if you have greater sodium potassium ATPase activity, you're going to be having greater rate of force development because you can break down that ATP faster and replenish it and refresh that ATP so that myosin and actin can be snapping through its cross-bridge cycling and moving faster and faster and faster. Right here, we're looking at just essentially a measurement of rate of force development. I'll move my face here so you can see it. Rate of force development. There's a few different ways you can measure this. You can measure this using some sort of isometric movements, like a mid-thigh pull, or let's say on the biodex on an isokinetic dynamometer, you can lock their knee in at a specific angle, and you can measure the amounts of force that they're producing and the speed at which they produce force. So if we're looking at this, right, we can see here the person in red right? They're explosively ballistic training compared to somebody who does heavy resistance training or they're untrained. They can produce force at a much higher capacity much faster. So their rate of force development is higher, which makes sense. If they're ballistically trained, they're used to be explosive and moving around, they've trained their body to produce force really, really fast. Now, if you're heavily resistance trained, you don't usually move weight as fast as you possibly can. Usually you're trying to move really, really heavy weight. So you may not have increased your rate of force development a lot, but after a certain period of time, you can continue to increase that rate of force development. So compared to an untrained person, once you hit a certain threshold, you can continue to go. However, in untrained populations, their maximum muscle strength will cater out or peter out much, much earlier. And essentially here, this is just a simple graph showing what rate of force development typically looks like. You see someone do a maximal MVIC here. You see this massive spike right away because that's the initiation of the muscle contraction itself. As that force begins to peak, it levels off and you kind of have an unsteady holding of that muscle contraction. This is pretty typical. Usually you don't see people hold muscle contraction at a very, very steady capacity. Usually there's some pretty good fluctuations in there. This is in general pretty steady, but you're not going to see someone hold like 710 Newtons all the way across. There's going to be some fluctuations there. So we're going to talk about some muscular fitness assessments. So the ACSM, the American College of Sports Medicine, uses the phrase muscular fitness to refer collectively to muscular strength, endurance, and power. So each component of muscular fitness improves consequent to an appropriately designed resistance training regimen, correctly performed resistance exercises. So if you're lifting things that are really, really heavy, you're going to be improving muscular strength. If you're lifting things that are moderately heavy or pretty heavy, but you're moving them as fast as you possibly can, that's going to be muscular power training. And if you're doing lots of repetitive, low weight, long duration training, that's going to be your muscular endurance training. So as trained muscles strengthen and enlargen or get larger, right? Resistance training stimulus must be progressively increased. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. But essentially saying you need to have the principle of progressive increase, right? So you need to be increasing weight over time. That's why if you do the same weight for a long period of time, it starts to feel lighter, right? It's essentially what strength training is. You are training your body to go through a stimulus and then adapt to that stimulus so that it's stronger the next time, so that when you do that lift again, it feels easier. So what do you do to keep working the body and keep making sure you go through muscular adaptation? You keep progressively increasing that resistance. Progressive overload is the term I was looking for. I apologize. The principle of progressive overload, where you are trying to increase the resistance, increase the intensity, the volume, whatever it is, essentially making that muscle work harder and harder and harder every single time so you can continue to increase your muscular gains. So there's a few different assessments of muscular fitness and hypertrophy. This one is more assessments of muscular size. So the first one being circumference, body composition analysis, ultrasound, and MRI. I'll get into all of those in just a second here. So circumference, essentially, circumference is just the circumference of the regional body portion of the muscle body. And it can be important to the quantity of body fat distribution. So you can be doing things like the thigh, the biceps, the forearm, the chest, the shoulders, the entire body essentially can be measured for circumferences. And this gives us information on the adiposity and the muscle size of the individuals. So circumference measures are not as accurate as more technologically advanced pieces of equipment, but they may offer valuable information when assessing regularly. So if you assess somebody day 1, day 40, day 80, you can assess those things over time and track their gains, track their muscle size, track their overall body size increase or decrease throughout a training program. Essentially what this is just showing is that this training or this body composition style is a low-cost alternative to these technologically advanced ones. However, if you're trying to be as thorough as possible, you'll want to use more in-depth, more advanced methods. However, if you're doing something, let's say, with a lot of people, you're just trying to track it in general over time, circumference measures are a pretty useful technique. Next one, densitometry. You see here, this is underwater weighing or hydrostatic weighing. Essentially, this is a measurement of body density. You can use this to measure adiposity and muscle fitness over time or muscle size over time. Essentially, you could put someone in day 1 and have them come back in again day 40. And if you see that their body is more dense, you can essentially infer that there was a loss of there was a loss of fat tissue and a gain of muscle tissue. Essentially, they're losing adiposity over time because they are becoming more dense. Next one is ultrasound. Ultrasound is something that we do a lot in our lab. You can do a lot of different things with ultrasound. You can look at the cross-sectional area of the muscle, which you see outlined here. That is the rectus femoris muscle of the quadriceps. You can look at the muscle thickness. So I can take a line and draw it from here to here, and I can tell you the muscle thickness of that muscle body itself. Or I can do something called echo intensity. And you don't really need to know what echo intensity is, but essentially what echo intensity does is it looks at a quality, or a quality measurement of the muscle itself. So it's an arbitrary measure of the refractance of the light, or excuse me, refractance of the sound going through the muscle body. And essentially we can use that to assess whether a muscle is high quality or low quality. And so this can be used in things like tracking training over time. If you want to see how much that training is damaging your muscle, you can put you through a stressor and then reassess your ultrasound, or excuse me, you can reassess your ultrasound echo intensity afterwards. And we can say, hey, there's a fair amount of damage occurring to this muscle. Maybe we need to pull back on our resistance training prescription, or maybe there's no damage occurring. We say, hey, the muscle quality is exactly the same. We need to increase the amount of resistance or the amount of volume or intensity that we're putting them through. Essentially, it's a way of objectively measuring the muscle to see if you are adequately damaging that muscle in order to stimulate adaptation at a later time. Next one is magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. We all probably have heard of an MRI. Usually it's not used for measuring cross-sectional areas of muscle because it's so expensive. But if you wanted to, this would be best case scenario. If you wanted to look at the cross-sectional area of a muscle, if you want to look at the muscle body in whole, if you want to look at the fascicles, the pennation angle, all of these things, MRIs are going to be very, very useful because they are the most advanced form of muscular imaging. However, like I said, not typically used for muscle assessment because it's just so expensive. Next, we're going to talk about assessments of muscular fitness and strength. So we're talking about a few of them here: hand grip strength, 1RM testing, isometric force. There's a gap there. I should have a gap there. I apologize for that. Isokinetic force, multiple RM testing, push-up tests, Wingate test, vertical jump. So essentially these first ones here, hand grip, 1RM, isometric, isokinetic force, are going to be measures of muscular strength. The multiple RM, like a 10 RM, 15 RM, or a push-up test, is going to be more a measure of muscular endurance. And then finally, the Wingate or the vertical jump are measures of explosive strength or power. So if we can do a hand grip test, this is a very, very simple and cost-effective measure of strength. I actually did my master's thesis on hand grip strength. Essentially, hand grip strength is a very good proxy measure for total body strength. Obviously, if I wanted to measure total body strength, then I have to do a whole bunch of different lifts and put you through a whole bunch of different protocols in order to measure that overall amount of strength. However, hand grip strength is a very good indicator of total body strength. And so all you really need to do is have somebody come in, grab one of these hand grip dynamometers, usually like a Jamar dynamometer, and have them squeeze as hard as they can for 2 or 3 seconds. And this gives a really good indication to total body strength, which also is a very good way to predict all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease. One of the things that we talked about in my master's thesis was talking about the prevalence of muscular strength and how it is not overly studied in terms of longevity, mortality, and cardiovascular disease. However, something like a 5 kilogram increase in hand grip strength equated to about a 16% decrease in all-cause mortality, essentially saying stronger individuals live longer and are less likely to die of all causes. And you can measure that with this very, very simple hand grip test. So there's a few different procedures that you can use, as well as there's some normative values. I'm not going to go through all of these. There's like 3 or 4 main procedures when you're doing a hand grip. You can pretty much use whichever one you want. The important thing is here is if you're going to compare somebody's values to normative values, you want to make sure that you are matching your protocol. So some protocols are like straight out away from your arm or straight out away from your shoulder. Some are the arm bent, squeezing as hard as you can. Some are starting above and then moving down. Just make sure whatever normative values that you would be comparing to, that the protocol that they use is identical to the one that you are using. Looking at repetition maximum. So this is something like a 1RM. I'm sure we've all heard of this. So this is traditionally the standard for dynamic strength. So movement or isotonic strength. If you like something like a squat, if you want to measure somebody's maximal squat, you're going to put them through a 1RM procedure. For this though, this can be very dangerous. If you are loading a spine or you're loading an individual with a maximal load and they're not familiar with the movements, you may incur a lot of injuries. So this is something that you do with more well-trained individuals, not something that you would typically do on somebody's first day in the gym. Usually you put them through a general strength training program for at least a little bit, probably at least 4 to 6 weeks before you have them do any 1RM testing when you're loading the spine like this. Now, you can do it a little bit more if you're doing like single leg or single joint movements, or you're doing things where they're not likely to hurt themselves as much. However, typically it's recommended that when you're doing 1RMs, you're doing it with someone who's at least moderately trained. This is also predictable for, there's predictability of maximal strength decreases with an increase in repetitions, right? So the predictability of these assessments aren't as good for predicting 1RM if you're doing, let's say, like a 10RM. Now, if you have an untrained individual, like I was saying, usually you could do something like a 6RM test, right? It's not quite as dangerous. More than likely, they'd be able to do 6 repetitions of a weight pretty easily without hurting themselves. However, the predictability of that 6RM test for 1RM is not as good as, let's say, like a 2RM test or like the 1RM test itself. So it's kind of a give and take. As the exercise prescription practitioner, you'd want to make sure that you were catering the repetition maximum assessment to your population. In a very, very fit population, 1RMs are fine. In a novice or untrained population, you want to use like 6 to 10 1RM maximums or 6 to 10 RM maximums to make sure that you are not hurting the individual while you were trying to estimate their 1RM. So again, here's the procedure for 1RM according to the ACSM guidelines. I'm not going to go through this. You can read this yourself if you want. Essentially, what these are doing is they're saying warm them up adequately, use a certain percentage, and then monitor them during the 1RM test. And once they fail to successfully lift that 1RM, you can say that their last successful lift is their 1RM test. Again, here are some normative values. I'm going to skip past these. You guys can look at those yourselves. No reason for me to read those to you. Now we see here isometric testing. So this is a test where you are locking a person or a participant in a specific angle and they're not changing that knee angle. So like here you see an isometric squat. So activation of the agonist muscle, but no change in muscle length, right? This requires force detection technology with an increase in testing, right? So while you can get a lot more variables from this, you can get rate of force development, you can get peak force, you can get S&A gradient of the force development with those force platforms. This obviously requires the force platform, so it requires a little bit more money. So it's useful in a lab population or in a lab setting. However, let's say in the training room, you might not have access to these 4 plates, and therefore you might not be able to do this testing. As well as this may not necessarily be practical for athletes. So if you're trying to measure maximal dynamic strength, so how explosive is somebody? Just because somebody can produce a lot of force in a stable muscle contraction, in a non-moving muscle contraction, does not necessarily mean that they're going to be able to jump higher, which is something that you might want in your sport. Not necessarily going to mean they're more explosive. It's a good proxy measure of it. People who typically have higher isometric strength will typically have more explosive capabilities. However, when you're monitoring like a sports team or like an athletic population, this isn't as useful for transfer to sport. However, it's useful for a bunch of other things like muscle quality assessment. It's useful as a just general tracking of strength over time, but its transfer to sport is not as great as something like a vertical jump test, which I think I'm going to get into shortly here. And then finally, isokinetic testing. So isokinetic testing, if you are not familiar with it, is essentially pretty similar to isotonic testing. However, instead of the resistance being the same at all times, the rates or the change of your muscle length is the same at all times. So you see here, if they're going from, let's say, 90 to 0 degrees, the rate at which they move their leg will be the same throughout the entire range of motion. If you've ever done, let's say, like a leg extension on a leg extension device, you know that you can move your leg however speed you want. For an isokinetic device, the idea is to push maximally against that resisting arm, but the resisting arm keeps you at the same exact speed. So this can assess angle-specific force and torque production. So because you're going at that same speed, essentially it's tracking you throughout that range of motion, and it gives you force values at each portion of that range of motion so that you can know how capable you are at generating force at that specific angle, right? And this is drastically more expensive. So these devices, the isokinetic devices, the Biodex, and in this case, the PhysioMed, are tens of thousands of dollars versus you can get some force plates for around $1,000. And then obviously that's even more expensive than the isotonic measurements. But the more expensive a piece of equipment gets, the more data you're usually able to get out of it. And then other assessments of muscular fitness, specifically power, is vertical jump and power clean. So a vertical jump, we've all known before, you're essentially just jumping as high as you possibly can. A power clean, we've seen before, or a clean snatch is just an explosive lifting or Olympic movement within the gym. So vertical jump, it's a cost-effective measure of power. So you can do it on a force plate. Usually that's the best way to do it. That's what we're seeing here. We're seeing the downward movement. We're seeing the upward movement as they jump. And then we're seeing them land here. So you see that huge spike in their in the force, which is just their landing force. It's not the force they produced. And then they're petering out and staying at their weight over the last few seconds. So you can do this without a force plate. You can do this with a Vertec device. You can do this with a jump mat, whatever have you. One thing I will say about this is if you're going to be doing vertical jumps, again, you want to make sure that not only is your protocol similar, but the way that you are measuring it is similar. There's a lot of intrinsic error and differences in vertical jump protocols between, like, let's say a Vertec or a force plate or a jump mat. So when you're comparing values, make sure if you're comparing values of your athletes or your individuals, you're comparing that to those that have conducted on the same exact device. So if you're doing a vertical jump on force plates, make sure you're comparing to people who've done jumps on force plates. If you're comparing a Vertec or a vertical device, the ones that you swat, make sure they're comparing it to other vertical jumps people have jumped and swatted. That way you can make the best comparisons. Let's get past this. Right, and so from this, you can estimate or you can use different equations to get peak and average power. Again, because this is a proxy measure and you're not actually measuring peak power or average power at that time, this will not be as accurate as, let's say, you doing it on an actual force plate or you doing like a wind gate assessment where you're measuring power over that period of time. However, it is a pretty good way to get a proxy measure of their estimated peak power and average power, and therefore it does have some utility when you're tracking training. Right, and then another resistance-based power assessment is load or velocity tracking program. So you see here, this is a Tendo unit. Essentially what this would be doing is this unit would be on the floor. You would attach this, strap to the end of the bar right there, and you can track the movement speed of that lift over time. And therefore, if you know the speed of the movement, then you know the weight of the movement. You know the weight of the movement because you're the one that put the bar or the plates on the bar. You can estimate their power, or you can calculate their power actually. And so these are used predominantly for looking at rep quality. So you have people come in, let's say they do 10 reps, right? They do 10 reps of a squat. Okay, cool. They did 10 reps of a squat. Okay, cool. They did that at 225 pounds. But what's their velocity throughout that movement? You can use this tracking software to analyze the velocity of their movement throughout those 10 reps as a proxy measure of their potential level of fatigue. So this is something called velocity-based training. You have somebody come in and you analyze their movement speed on their first day, and then you analyze it again 2 weeks later and you see, hey, they're moving way faster. Good. Maybe we can probably up the training, or they're getting stronger, right? Or they're doing the same weight and they're moving slower and you're saying, they're really fatigued today. Maybe we should modulate their training a little bit, turn down the intensity a little bit because they're getting fatigued. So those are a few different ways you can use velocity-based training, right? And so looking at this, or still talking about this, we're talking about the force velocity curve. Essentially what this is showing is a curve at which you're generating the most power. So typically the highest power in movements is somewhere around a moderate weight. Because if you have a really, really heavy weight, you're not gonna be able to move it as fast. So the force velocity curve illustrates that greater amount of concentric force generated, the slower the muscle shortening or corresponding movement velocity. So essentially, there's two different things that come into play here. If you are lifting a really, really heavy weight, it is really, really hard to move that weight really fast, and therefore power won't be really high. But also, if you are moving a really, really light weight, when you're estimating power, the resistance in that power equation is not as high, so power won't be as high. But also, because you are lifting a really, really light weight, you were able to move really, really, really fast, which is going to diminish the efficiency of force production. If you're moving that muscle body through its range of motion really fast, it is not able to generate force as readily. So maximum power, in contrast, is produced at intermediate velocities with the lifting of a light to moderate, not maximal load. So we see here at a more moderate load, at a more moderate velocity, we're going to see the greatest amount of power. And so if you're trying to do power training, that's why you see people will do anything from like 4 to 8 repetitions of maximal repetitions when they're moving that load or resistance as fast as they possibly can. So you get percentage of power training, right? So power output at 90% on 1 RM, maybe twice as high as power output at 100% the 1 RM of back squat. So when you're training power, usually you don't do maximal weight, right? So to promote training program specificity, particularly load and repetition assignments, are indicated for athletes training for single effort power events. So shot put, high jump, weightlifting, and for multiple effort power events like basketball and power. So if you're doing something like, let's say, a shot put, you're going to be doing more power training, let's say, with a heavy power object. So you're going to have a really heavy object and try to move that as fast as you can one time, right? But if you're in something like basketball or power where you're doing explosive things multiple times, you're going to be doing exercises or resistance training that are multiple power events. So something like doing a power clean like 25 times, or doing multiple vertical jumps or box jumps, things that are explosive in nature but are repetitive. Versus, let's say, again, like a shot put where you're just doing one throw, you're probably going to mimic that in the training room by doing one explosive movement of a heavy weight. So in short, you are trained to be powerful in your movement during sport. Train as similar as possible in the weight room. So sprinters should do a lot of low load maximal velocity work, and heavy power athletes like a shot put should do a lot of heavy load velocity work. So essentially, you're trying to mimic the on-field or on-the-court performance as closely as possible. Then finally, we can look at fitness of muscular endurance. So essentially what you see here is a hand grip test. This is a little bit different though, because you are doing repetitive contractions. So we see here, this is a 60 contraction protocol where they're producing force 60 times over a 3-minute period, I think this is, over a 3-minute period. This was done within the lab, or done within our lab here at UCF. Essentially though, what you see here is you see something called a critical power curve. So we see here we have this maximal force over time, and then it begins to decrease on a continuum, and then there's kind of a jump here, but for the most part, it stays relatively steady over the last piece of the last portion of contractions. And it's going down a little bit, which can be expected because of fatigue mechanisms. But overall, there's a high force output at the beginning, and then it peters out, and then it begins to level out over time. And so there's a few different ways that you can measure this for muscular endurance. Something that's as simple as like a push-up test. This is a little bit more involved one where we're having a force measuring device, in this case a hand grip, and then doing it over and over and over and over and over again. Not to be confused with the maximal hand grip test, where you just squeeze as hard as you can that one time and get that one maximal force value. Oh, froze here, apologize. Oh, go back. All right, we see this critical power curve there. All right, our next one, right? Looking at, like I said, a push-up test, right? I'm not going to go through these procedures with you in depth. You can look at them for yourselves. Again, one more time, make sure that you are matching the procedures. So whatever form they're dictating, however they want your feet, whatever they want for the space between the repetitions, the amount of time between repetitions, make sure you're matching that with the normative values, the normative value protocol to ensure that there's the best comparison between those. Right, there's assessments of muscular fitness, aerobic capacity, and endurance, your VO2 max. So essentially, this is something that you guys probably all heard about or seen before, an assessment of VO2 max. Essentially, these are ways of measuring aerobic fitness. So VO2 max is the maximal ability of the mitochondria, the muscle cells within the body, to consume and utilize oxygen to produce ATP or produce energy, right? So if you are measuring this, right, you can measure this at the beginning of your training program, put them through an aerobic training program, and then measure at the end and say, hey, we have increased your mitochondrial efficiency for utilizing oxygen. Therefore, we can say that you're more aerobically fit, right? As well as we can use this in at-risk populations. So we can look at people who have cardiovascular disease, people who have COPD, lung issues, people who have blood cell deficiencies or blood cell issues, right? And we look at that and we can say, okay, your VO2 max is low. What are some things, some prescriptions, some, in our case, exercise prescription, in others' case, medical prescriptions that we can give to these individuals to increase the amount of oxygen that their body can utilize and increase the overall efficiency of aerobic ATP production. So talking about exercise prescriptions. So usually exercise is broken down into 4 main components. You have your warm up, you have your conditioning, you have your cool down, and then sometimes you have your stretching. Now, stretching, neither here nor there. Usually a lot of people do a lot of dynamic stretching at the beginning of exercises now, and so the need for static stretching at the end is not as prevalent. However, the first 3 here, a warm up, the conditioning, and the cool down, are always very important. You want to essentially warm people up to try to limit injury and make sure that they're ready to go, that they're able to exercise for your events. The actual conditioning portion is our obvious portion. It's what you're trying to train that day. And the cool down is always very important as well. If you are working with individuals who are pretty novice-ly trained, or you just got done doing maximal work, you want to make sure that you're having a cool down so that you can redistribute that blood flow throughout the body and not have instances where you see blood pooling in the legs and have people passing out or whatever have you. Right. So goals for health-related resistance training programs. So for your general population, right, your most important thing essentially saying here is daily or activities of daily living. So you'll be training them in things, you'll be training them in movements that they would use in activities of daily living. So you'll see a lot of times in resistance training protocols or physical therapy for elderly individuals, a lot of their workout session is just standing up out of a chair, or lifting their arm up to grab something off a shelf, or opening a door, or squeezing so they can grab the door, whatever it might be. You'll see a lot of people who have reconstruction on their knee, right? So reconstructive knee surgeries. All they're really working on is just simple knee flexion and extension. They're working on just walking. If you have people who have spinal injuries, you get them used to walking again, walking with the correct posture, right? If you're training for general health of the population, your goal should not necessarily be to just make them as strong as you possibly can. It should be to work them in things they would be utilizing in daily living, like stair climbing, right? Just lifting that knee up, getting that hip flexion, getting that knee flexion, and then being able to extend and push with the quadriceps so that they can lift their body up to the next step. For all training programs, you're going to follow something called the FIT principle, or something that's been adapted to the FIT VP principle. So the FIT principle, the first letter, FITs being F, frequency. So for general muscle fitness, particularly those who are untrained or recreationally trained, you should resistance train major muscle groups 2 to 3 days per week, at least 48 hours separating the same group of muscles, right? So this is something like we talk about the bro split in lifting, chest, tries, back, bis, and legs. There's some science to that. There's a lot of good science showing that this is very, very good for muscle hypertrophy. This is why this is potentially a little bit better than the arm split that some people will do. So the push-pull split, which I'm sure you guys have all heard of. So push-pull, people will do, that is the push-pull. Some people that will do the arm chest splits, right? So the push-pull, sorry to be confusing. The push-pull split is the back, bis, chest, tries splits. The alternative split, which is done sometimes, which doesn't have as great evidence for it, is the back, the large muscle group, and then the accessory muscle group split, where people will do chest and back in the same day and biceps and triceps in the same day. And the reason that the chest, back, biceps, triceps in the same day are not as good is because when you do chest on, let's say, a Monday, you are working your triceps when you're doing chest exercises. So then when you come on Tuesday and now you're specifically targeting your triceps, right? You still have some fatigue left over from Monday, and therefore you may not be getting the most efficient training stimulus because you are fatigued, not as able to lift as much, not as much muscle damage, and therefore not as much subsequent adaptation. Now, I'm not saying you should never train like this. I'm just saying that typically the push-pull, the chest and tries, and then back and bi split is a little bit more, has a little bit more efficacy to it because you are getting that 48 hours of separation between the same muscle group. Now, the I in the FIT stands for intensity. So this is the lift, or this is the weight at which you are lifting. And remember, we talked about absolute or relative intensity. You can talk about intensity in terms of the absolute weight they're lifting. So 225 pounds of the squat. Or typically in training programs, you use a percentage of their 1RM. So we'll say, all right, we're doing a 3x8 today at 75% of your 1RM. You put 75% of the 1RM on the bar, and you have them do their 3x8, whatever it might be. On the right here, you see a general chart of the number of repetitions allowed, or the number of repetitions that can typically be done. So let's say if we're doing a lift that's 85% of their 1RM, typically you would have them do something like 6 repetitions of that. If let's say you're putting on what you think is 85% of their 1RM, you can also use this chart to estimate whether or not that is truly accurate. So you can look at it and say, okay, we think that 85% of their 1RM is 6 repetitions. Then you have them do the lift and they're able to do like 12, right? You would know that that's probably not truly their 85% of their 1RM. And now you can modulate and adapt your training prescription accordingly. Experienced individuals may progress to greater than 80%. Vigorous or very vigorous. So essentially, you do not want to be putting individuals that are novice to loads that are higher than 80% of their estimated 1RM until you feel that they are very, very comfortable with that and they have been trained over a period of time. And by comfortable, I don't mean they've done it once. Comfortable by their form looks good, they're able to solidly and consistently move throughout the range of motion for a repetition, and then you can say, all right, we are ready to move on. And then another note here, loads lower than 50% typically improve muscular endurance. And the reason being is if you are lower than 50%, you're going to be doing multiple repetitions, 20 to 30 repetitions. And again, if you remember, muscular endurance is the ability to perform repetitive contractions which again is training for muscular endurance. Now, this next chart here, this is used by the ACSM, this is used by the NSCA. Essentially, this is a training continuum. This is a training scale of when you should be doing, what rep schemes you should be using for specific training styles. And I don't like this coloration of this scale because it makes it seem like green is the best, right? What you're looking for here is you're looking for these yellow zones, okay? You're looking very specifically for these yellow zones. That's where you want to be training. So if you're training for strength, you want to be using anywhere from 2 to 6 repetitions. I would say specifically for maximal strength, you're going to shift more towards the 1, 2 to 3 repetitions. For power, you're going to be training anywhere from 2 to 5 repetitions or 2 to 6 with maximal velocity intent. For hypertrophy, your rep schemes are going to be usually from 6 to 12. And that's why you hear a lot of people saying like, oh, you're doing a 3 by 10, right? Because a 3 by 10 or a 5 by 10 is traditionally the best way to get muscle hypertrophy. If you're just trying to be healthier and you're trying to look better, you're trying to look fit and toned for the beach or whatever it might be, right? Usually people train muscle hypertrophy because you get the greatest outward or extrinsically seen adaptations and gains. And so a lot of people will train in that 3-10 or 5-10 or whatever it might be. And then anything over 12 repetitions is going to be the greatest training stimulus for muscular endurance. And so you want to modulate the amount of repetitions that you're doing per set to make sure that you're training within these windows. One other thing that I will say that's not noted here is that you want to make sure that you are controlling your rest times. The biggest mistake that I see in training programs is that nobody even really cares about the rest times at all, or even prescribes them correctly. So essentially the rule of thumb being is the heavier an object you are lifting, the less repetitions that you are lifting that object, the longer the rest time you need. So typically for strength training or power training, you'll see rest times anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes, which is what you should be doing. They make the joke of, let's say power trainers or Olympic trainers where they'll lift the weight one time, then they'll throw out a folding chair and they'll sit in it and they'll wait there for 5 minutes. That's what they should be doing. If they're trying to adequately train or provide muscular adaptation for muscle strength and muscular power, that rest time, that longer rest time is really important. Now for hypertrophy, typically you want to see anywhere from a 60 to 120 second break. Something that I see happening a lot, specifically in those novice or those beginner training programs, is when individuals are doing those 5 by 10s. Yeah, they're doing 5 sets, they're doing 10 repetitions. They might be even doing the right intensity of that weight. However, typically I'll see rest times like 30 seconds, or I'll see rest times like 3 minutes, right? You want to make sure to get the adequate stimulus or the adequate muscular adaptation stimulus that you are controlling intensity, you're controlling the amount of repetitions they're doing, but also you are controlling the rest times, which leads into the next part of the FIT principle, the first T, time. So no specific duration of entire training session has been identified for effectiveness. And essentially what that's saying is the length of the training session is not overly important. What is actually important is the time between sets, making sure that you are timing the rest between those sets in order to enable the greatest overall adaptation. So part of the time principle is essentially you need to adapt their training style or their training regimen to the time that they have available. So this can be challenging in things like D1 athletes, where you have a certain amount of time that they can be in the weight room and on the field, and you have coaches who, understandably so, want to take as much time with their athletes as they possibly can to teach them the mechanisms and the concepts and the overall flow in the actual sport itself. However, you want to make sure that you're still trying to squeeze in as much resistance training as you can. But sometimes coaches will kind of go over on their time, or they'll want to take a little bit more of that training time, so you don't have as much time to put them through resistance training. And so part of the challenge there may be modulating your exercise prescription to make sure that you are fitting what you need to get done into a certain period of time, while also making sure you're hitting the correct intensities, you're hitting the correct volume, and you're hitting the correct rest times between those. Now, the next T in the FIT principle is type. So resistance exercise involving all major muscle groups, so chest, shoulders, upper, lower back, abdomen, hips, legs, right? Multi-joint exercises affecting more than one muscle group and targeting agonist and antagonist muscle groups are recommended. So typically, especially when you're crunched for time, you want to do multi-joint complex movements, typically for a few reasons. First one being you're activating the most muscles, and therefore you're getting the most overall training stimulus. The second one being is typically multi-joint exercises are the most transferable to sports. There's not very many movements in the sport where you're moving only one joint at a time, or maybe even only 2 joints at a time. Even when you're shooting a basketball, something as simple as a free throw, right? You're moving your elbow, you're moving your shoulder, you're moving your wrist, you're moving your hips, you're moving your knees, and probably your ankles. So a all body movement, even something like throwing a dart, something as simple as throwing a dart, right? You're moving elbow and wrist. right? So most movements in sports are multi-joint movements, and therefore you want to make sure that you're training multi-joint movements in the gym. Now, if you're in a novice or an untrained population, something like an aging population, you can use some of those more single joint movements because they're not using them as much in sport. So you can use those single joint movements to kind of prepare them for their multi-joint movements, like getting out of a chair or walking up a step of stairs or reaching up, right? You would want to try to make sure that you employ still as many multi-joint movements as possible. However, in aging or novice populations, you may need to use those single joint movements in order to get to more complex multi-joint movements. See, that's pretty much what I really want to cover there. All right, and then following up on type, right? Oh, sorry. Following up type is the V. So after the last T is V for VP, right? Volumes, repetition times sets. So 8 to 12 repetitions to improve hypertrophy in most adults, 15 to 25 to improve muscular endurance. This is what we talked about with the chart earlier. And 2 to 4 sets are recommended to improve strength and power in most adults. And then more than 2 sets are recommended to improve endurance. So essentially, like the graph that we showed earlier, the chart that we showed earlier, right? You want to make sure you're hitting the right intensity for these training styles. You want to make sure that you're in the yellow here for these training styles, and you want to make sure that you're giving them adequate rest. And then our final principle, progression, or the principle of progressive overload. So essentially, you want to make sure that you're going through a gradual progression of greater resistance and or more repetitions per set, or you're increasing the frequency in which they're working out. So typically, you would start with something, let's say, like a 3-day-a-week program. You'd schedule them, you'd have them doing a certain intensity, a certain volume, lifts. And then as they begin to progress, you want to increase intensity, or you want to increase volume, or you want to increase the frequency which you were doing those lifts, or the amount of lifts that you were doing, essentially following the principle of progressive overload. Eventually, their body is going to adapt to the stimulus that you're putting them through. So you want to make sure that you are progressing that stimulus in order to make sure that there is a progression of that adaptation over time, and therefore continuation of those muscular gains. The most common approach to this is typically to increase load or intensity. So usually most people will increase either the volume of their lifting or they'll increase the amount of weight on the bar itself. Right, and then talking about a final little principle here, this isn't part of it, but talking about maintenance. So muscular strength may be maintained by training muscle groups as little as 1 day a week, as long as training intensity or the resistance lifted is held constant. So essentially, you have participants, you have people that come through when you're going through an increase or a muscle adaptation phase. You be training them as often as you possibly can, but still ensuring rest. But let's say you're going through a season, or they don't have time to come in, or they're doing a lot of other things with their lives, and so they're fatigued a lot. You can maintain muscular strength by training as little as 1 day a week. I think the typical time is about 10 to 20 days when you start to see a decrease in muscular strength after no training. And even after that 10 to 20 days, it's not a large increase. You're not going to see like a 20% decrease, excuse me. But typically in a maintenance phase, you want to be hitting each muscle group at least once per week. So here's a few different recommendations for these types. So for frequency, intensity, time, type, repetitions, sets, pattern, progression, you can read through these all yourselves. I'm not going to go through these. Essentially, remember that these are recommendations, but they're strongly recommended. Something that I will hear from my students a lot is they'll be like, oh yeah, I see that's recommended, but I don't really like that. I don't like doing it that way. I hate to break it to you, but these recommendations are built by experts that have worked in the field for decades, okay? So they probably know a little bit more about muscle adaptation and training than you do in your novice stage as an undergraduate student doing personal training. So for now, I would highly recommend following a lot of these guidelines, at least as you begin training. Then as you become more involved and you become more inclined to understand your individual, you can begin to modulate these things. But again, keep in mind the modulation that you're doing. So if you're increasing rest time, know what that's doing to adaptation. If you're increasing the resistance, know what that might be doing to adaptation, know what that might be doing to the recovery. All these things, remember, kind of function on a continuum, and they're kind of interwoven together. So when you're changing one thing, make sure that you're probably also changing something else, right? You're not just changing somebody from 5x10 at 80% of their 1RM to 5x10 at 95% of their 1RM, right? If you're going to go from 80 to 95% of 1RM, you need to decrease the amount of reps. Or let's say that you're massively increasing the volume. You're increasing the volume they're lifting by 40 repetitions and by a lot of weight, right? You want to make sure that you're increasing you want to make sure that you're probably decreasing the frequency in which they're working out. Like I said, however, over time, if you're doing progressive overload, you're going to see that jump from the very end of your 10-week training session, the very beginning of your 10-week training session, the very end, you'll probably see that large jump in frequency. You'll probably see a large jump in volume and a large jump in intensity. However, when you're changing it week by week, you want to make sure that as you modulate one thing, as you turn one dial up, you're probably going to have to be changing or turning one dial down a little bit, or at least kind of balancing that turn up with a few other different things. Essentially, the principle being here is that follow these recommendations the best as you can. And as you begin to tweak things, make sure that you understand how it influences other things within the training program. And I think that's really all I have for you. Thank you guys for listening. I know I went through that pretty fast. I know one of the notes from last year's lecture for this chapter was that it was really long. So I tried to make it as fast as I possibly could for you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is a little bit more in my realm. Dr. Freddie is obviously very, very inclined and more of an expert in this than I am. However, this is something that I feel very comfortable with myself. So if you have any questions, feel free to come to me, ask me some questions. If there's something that I can answer, I'm sure will be able to answer it. And she may even have some better answers for you than I would for most of these questions in general. But I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. And I will see you guys in class. Have yourselves a good day.